Hello world civilizations, and welcome back to topic 2 of this week. As you hopefully already know, this time we're going to be looking at the start of the universalizing religions that quickly began to spread across the world during the end and after the Roman period. Now, as always, we'll start off with looking at the key terms. We're going to start off by defining what a universalizing religion actually is. We're going to be looking at the famous Constantine, who is given quite a bit of credit for the spread of Christianity across Rome. We'll look at the Nicene Creed. We'll look at the Byzantium Empire, actually. I always pronounce that wrong. And we'll end looking at Hinduism and the Sanskrit Cosmopolis. Again, I want to make sure you're all aware, of course, of important upcoming dates and assignments. I already talked about this in the last video, so I won't spend a ton of time on it here. But please do be aware these assignments exist, and let me know as soon as you possibly can if there are any questions. In the meantime, let's look at a universalizing religion. I want you to think of what exactly you would do if you were trying to create your own universal religion. Think about how you're going to get it to appeal to people, how you're going to get it to spread across different cultures and ethnicities. If we're able to, I'd like you to debate this in a discussion forum at some point. So do be aware, do keep this discussion in mind. Think about how we would deal with in America, for example, with the universal religion. So, in the meantime, I'm just going to explain that really quick, or in the interest of time, I'm just going to explain that very quickly. I'll get to talking eventually, and we'll go ahead and move on. But do just be aware that this discussion is going to come up in the future. In the meantime, as I said, historians have identified a few key characteristics to making a universal religion. First, your religion has to have a broad appeal to diverse populations. Now, this may seem obvious, but why is it necessary? Yes, very good, imaginary audience. Again, your religion's only going to really be a local religion if you can appeal to multiple cultures and multiple ethnicities. Otherwise, it's only going to be a local religion. What kind of messages do you think appeal to diverse groups of people? Think about last lesson, for example. Again, very good. Good job remembering from last time class. Typically, universal messages of some sort of universal acceptance or equal standard are very good at appealing to multiple groups of people. For example, we mentioned that last week that Christianity's emphasis on everyone being equal in the eyes of God made it a very effective religion to spread across the world. Secondly, a religion has to also be able to specifically adapt to various cultures and geographies. This is very similar, of course, to adapting to multiple different types of populations and demographic groups. One of the ways, for example, and we'll talk about this more in detail in a second, how religions have been able to adopt to various cultures is by, instead of trying to erase the culture that the religion arrives in, they instead attempt to adopt part of that area's culture into their own religion. Do any of you know of any specific examples of how a religion has done that? To give you a hint, how has maybe Islam, for example, accomplished that? We'll talk about that more in detail in a couple of weeks, by the way. Alright, this is maybe a bit of a more obscure fact if you're not actually Islam, which of course I'm sure many of you are not. For those of you who don't know, Islam actually teaches that Jesus did in fact exist, but in Islam he's considered to be a great prophet instead of being the Son of God. So essentially, instead of trying to wipe away Jesus' influence completely, they just claim, oh, he's a part of our religion, he's just not the main part, or the central part of this religion. So essentially, instead of just going into new Christian populations and saying, hey, your religion's stupid and has no meaning, they try to adopt portions of it into their own. Many other religions try to attempt things like this, and we'll discuss some of them today. Also, you have to have a promotion of a set of universal rules and principles that can fit a variety of situations. So one specific way you're able to get your religion to be adaptable is to have some sort of universal rule system that any culture is capable of following. Are there any examples you can think of? Alright, yes, very good. The Ten Commandments are, of course, a classic example of this. It's things like don't steal, don't kill, respect God, respect your parents, things like that. Very universal moral codes that many different cultures already have anyway. Makes a religion much easier to adopt. Also, you need to be able to have you need to have preachers who are charismatic and can reach out to new converts. St. Paul, who we mentioned last week, was of course a great example, and the Buddha and his original disciples are another great example. Great teachers who were able to inspire new converts to join your new religion. You also need to have a deep sense of community felt by your various followers. Why is this maybe particularly necessary, for example, for ancient Christianity? What happened to Christianity before it was legalized? Again, very good Christian historians in here. This is particularly valuable for the early days of a religion if it's persecuted or not accepted by the government. It essentially ensures that the followers are going to stay together and not just break apart when things get tough. Finally, you have to have support from a powerful empire typically, because without an empire's financial backing, living just a simple missionary life or a simple monk life doesn't exactly rake in the bills, so you're not going to really be able to afford to travel and spread your religion. The backing of an empire means you have some sort of official support, makes you seem much more respectable, and gives you the resources needed to spread your religion. Now, we already talked a little bit about how Buddhism spread across the Silk Roads and how Mahayana Buddhism made it a more universal practice. So we're going to spend most of our day today talking about Christianity, because we've barely talked about it so far. Once Christianity got started, they followed a divine codex, as it was called at the time, which was a mixture of ancient Jewish texts, so for example, texts from the Torah, and newly authoritative Christian texts. Now, for anyone who understands a little bit about how the Bible is supposed to work, in Christianity, what makes a text authoritative? Let's sort of sit here and wait. I hope you all enjoy these pauses as much as I do. But yes, again, for any of you who are familiar with how the Bible works, the idea is that a text is authoritative because it was inspired by God. So essentially, whoever wrote the text is believed to have been inspired by God in order to do it. We'll talk a little bit in just a second and later in the course how early Christians decided what texts were authoritative and what weren't. But this would eventually lead to a collection of texts in this divine codex that would eventually form into the Bible. Now, important thing that separated Christianity from other religions at the time was this idea that Christians should follow Yahweh, their word for God, one of their words for God at least, at the expense of all other worldly rulers. Now, is this a good thing for a religion to do? And is it going to create problems for these early Christians? Awkward pause again. Sorry, I almost dropped my water. Yes, of course, I'm not going to necessarily tell you how to feel about that first question, because that is somewhat opinion-based, or pretty much entirely opinion-based. But obviously, there's going to be two major perspectives for this question. On the one hand, many people are, of course, going to really like the idea of a very intense devotion to your religion, and it's going to help inspire that deep sense of community, since you're prioritizing this community even over your political allegiance. However, as many of you probably already know, this intense devotion did lead to a lot of problems for early Christians. One thing I didn't have a ton of time to talk about last week is how Rome was actually quite religiously diverse and religiously tolerant for the most part. As I mentioned, however, Rome was essentially just copied religious traditions from other places they were conquering and just incorporated them into their own beliefs, as long as you just still had your supreme loyalty to the emperor. As you might guess, it's the Christians' emphasis on ignoring the emperor in favor of God that led to this intense persecution. Because of this, there were many martyrs in recorded Christian history. Martyrs are, of course, individuals who are persecuted and mostly killed for their faith. One individual named Tertullian, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, who was a North African theologian, even went so far as to claim that Christianity was built upon the blood of these martyrs. Now, how is that belief? Could that belief maybe be used to inspire others in following Christianity? Very good again, religious historians in here. It's essentially giving these early Christians someone to look up to and an ideal to aspire to, essentially. The idea is that we should recognize and be appreciative of the sacrifice martyrs made in order to allow Christianity to be established, so we should try to make sure that our devotion matches theirs in following Christianity. This is one reason why early Christians especially were very insistent about talking about these martyrs. It encouraged devotion to the religion. A couple of specific examples. You have the Sicilian martyrs who were beheaded in Carthage around 180 CE for claiming Jesus was the King of Kings and Emperor of all nations. So again, it's this devotion to Jesus and God at the expense of Roman rulers that often invited this persecution. You also have the account of Vibia Perpetua, depicted here, and her handmaiden, who were condemned to face wild beasts in a Carthaginian amphitheater for refusing to sacrifice to Roman gods. So again, martyrs were a very important part of early Christian history, and were used later to inspire increased devotion to the Christian religion. Also, you'll see in a lot of true classical paintings of these martyrs, such as this here, a very stoic and faithful depiction of these individuals. This, of course, is to emphasize their faith and the level of faith that is possible to achieve in Christianity and that people should aspire to. So even in this picture, these people were essentially so devoted that they stayed loyal and unworried with God despite the fact that they had this bull bearing down on them. So again, showing this ideal that Christians should try to aspire to. Now, next we're of course going to finally get into how Constantine established Christianity as a more official religion and encouraged its spread across the world. Constantine was the emperor in Rome from around 280 to 337 CE. He started off as a professional Roman soldier who was eventually declared emperor after the death of his father. In 312 CE, he was fighting for control of the Roman Empire and fighting for the control of Rome itself specifically, when it is reported that he had a dream in which he saw a banner, which you can see here, which stated, "In this sign conquer." The sign was the first two letters of Christos put together, or anointed one. This again will of course show the devotion he needs to have to Jesus in this case. By 313 CE, he had officially legalized Christianity and provided tax exemption to bishops. Now, this of course sounds like a great story of the triumph of Christianity, but many historians have also emphasized the fact that Christianity was already very widely practiced and popular in Rome before Constantine's conversion. So, this raises the question, was Constantine a genuine convert? Yeah, that one's of course a bit difficult to tell for sure one way or the other, but it is important to recognize that this could be another example of a ruler, as we mentioned before, using religion in order to unite their empire. So on the one hand, it is entirely possible that he was a genuine convert, but on the other, he could be just another example of a ruler using a popular religion in order to unite his people. Now, this unification became more realized by 325 CE with the famous Nicene Creed. In 325 CE, Constantine summoned all the Christian bishops across the Roman Empire to Nicaea in order to hold a council to establish a universal creed, or creed, which comes from the Latin word credo, for I believe, for Christianity. So essentially, just to summarize, what he wanted to do was to establish a universal belief system for all Christians within the Roman Empire. Now, why might that be useful for Constantine, for Christianity to have a universal creed? Awkward pause again. At least I have a Halloween shirt on this time. Yeah, to help you out with this one, think a little bit about all the Christian denominations today. Take a moment to just sort of list off all the denominations you can think of, even just in your hometown, for example. Yeah, in my hometown, for example, we've got Baptist, we've got Catholic, we've got Methodist, we've got Presbyterian, we've got Lutheran, we have Church of God, we have Episcopalian, I think it's pronounced. So it's at least 7 denominations of churches just in my little hometown that I can think of off the top of my head. If you're Constantine and looking at it from his perspective, having all these different denominations in Christianity is going to make it very difficult to keep this empire religiously united. So Constantine wants to encourage one universal belief in Christianity, so everyone can be united religiously and prevent all the religious conflict that comes along with different denominations. As I'm sure many of you are aware of, for example, especially in this part of the world or part of the country, some of the conflict and disagreements that can still occur between Catholics and Protestants, for example, particularly. Constantine's trying to cut down this kind of conflict, even though, of course, Protestants don't exist yet. But anyway, a couple of crucial creed decisions that were made during this council. First, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit were now universally agreed to be one single divine being. This, of course, is important because it recognizes the divinity of Jesus, as many of you would be aware. Most people would assume this was a universal belief in Christianity from the beginning, but this was actually the first time it was more or less universally agreed upon by various Roman Christians. It was also established that Easter would now be celebrated on the same day by every Christian church all across the world, again promoting some sort of unity. Now, next thing I want to get into a little bit is the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Around this time, after the establishment of Christianity, various Goth and Hun groups started to lead violent immigrations into the Roman frontier. One of the main reasons historians have claimed that the Roman Empire fell is that as it continued to expand, it became virtually impossible to raise enough taxes to control this enormous empire. Why would so much expansion make it harder to raise all these taxes? Right. Very good. Once again, audience watching at home. Of course, the more territory you control, the more money you would have to raise in order to rule it effectively. So essentially, that Roman emperor ideal of constantly fighting the barbarians and expanding turned against the Roman Empire because they essentially grew too large for them to be able to control themselves. This situation was made worse when the Goths were invited by the emperor himself in 378 to join his forces, where they would eventually start raiding portions of the Roman Empire. Attila the Hun, from about 406 to 453 CE, also led various raids all across Roman and Gothic tribes within the Roman Empire. By 476 CE, the last Roman emperor in the West had resigned and was ousted by a German, quote-unquote, barbarian named Odoacer. I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly. Now, something we're going to talk about a little bit more specifically in the coming weeks is the idea that even after this fall, many people in the former Western Roman Empire still consider themselves to be Roman, because around this same time, they still claimed allegiance to the newly formed Roman Catholic Church, which we'll spend much more time talking about over the coming weeks. So, one thing I want you to all go ahead and start discussing and debating amongst yourselves is this question. Are these people still Roman? Because on the one hand, they don't really have any political allegiance or political reason to call themselves Roman anymore, because there's no Roman Empire to stay loyal to, but they're still connected to a cultural institution that was started by Rome. So, are they still Roman? And also ask yourselves this question that many historians still ask. Did Rome actually fall, or did it just change? I can't really give you a definitive answer for that. That's something I'd like you to discuss amongst yourselves. But in the meantime, another reason historians like to debate whether or not Rome actually fell is that a Roman Empire actually did continue in the East. While Rome did again fall in the West, there was still the Byzantium Empire, which continued out in the East. This empire included former Roman territories such as Greece, Iraq, Egypt, and modern-day Saudi Arabia. To give you a couple of examples of how this empire was actually about as prestigious and great as Rome itself. Constantinople was the capital of this Eastern Empire, which, as you might guess from the name, was a city founded by Constantine himself. This city consisted of about 500,000 plus citizens and 4,000 plus palaces. There were regular chariot races and gladiator games across the empire, and their trade was so productive that they received about 20,000 tons of trade in grain annually just within the city. Another example of the political continuation of Rome, Emperor Justinian, who ruled from about 527 to 565, established a new body of Roman law in his publications, the Digest and the Institutes. So again, Rome still seemingly seems to be continuing out in the East. So again, is this still the Roman Empire? And if so, what does it really mean to be Roman? Because many people would have claimed originally that having allegiance to Rome or being Roman meant you still had some connection to the original Roman city itself and original Roman territory. However, as I said, Rome is now gone at this point, but these people still claim to be a part of the Roman Empire. So again, what does it really mean to be Roman? And maybe by extension even, what does it mean to be America? If Washington, D.C. fell and huge portions of America still fell, would we still be American? That's just something for you to chew on a little bit. I think it's an interesting question at least. But anyway, to wrap things up, we're going to go back to what the Indus River Valley and modern-day India was up to, and look at the birth of Hinduism. As we talked about a couple of weeks ago, Buddhism and Jainism had become very popular as sort of a backlash against Vedic Brahmin teachings, so they had become very popular in the cities. Because of this, the Vedic Brahmin priests started to go out and spread their teachings to rural areas across India. These new teachings would eventually become known as Hinduism, as the Brahmin priests try to make their religion a bit more universal. A couple of important ideas from this religion. Hinduism now became a largely vegetarian religion. Many individuals, because of their allegiance to these various religious traditions, had already become vegetarians, so this essentially made the religion seem more accessible. There was also a new trinity in Hinduism, where you worshipped Brahma, the god of birth, Vishnu, the god of existence, and Shiva, the god of destruction. One other important characteristic of Hinduism that set it apart a bit was its adoption of other gods. Pretty specific example is that Hinduism accepted Buddha as an avatar of Vishnu. So again, instead of denying the existence or the importance of Buddha, they just said, oh, he's just sort of the human form of one of our gods. He actually does kind of matter. Now, why would this make the religion spread particularly, do you think? Remember my earlier Jesus and Islam example. Yes, again, it's essentially an example of cultural assimilation instead of cultural erasure. It's much easier to come into a new culture and say, hey, your culture is pretty good, let me just show you how to make it better, instead of saying, hey, your culture is terrible, here's my religion, take it or die. So again, it makes it much easier to adapt to. Hinduism also popularized the concept of bhakti, which is the practice of individual and personal devotion rituals done with the gods. So instead of having to do it in a big temple with a priest around, you can now pray and devote yourself to the gods individually in the comfort of your own home. Now, why is this going to make the religion more accessible, do you think? As again, I just stroked my beard like a James Bond villain. But yes, again, very good audience at home. It's very much like the universal message of Christianity. Now, instead of having to go to temples and commune with any elite priest or whatever it might be, anyone can now have and show their devotion to Hinduism in the comfort of their own home. Now, last thing we'll look at is how Indian religion spread across the area. One thing that held Indian religion back, seemingly, was the fact that unlike Rome and the countries along the Silk Road we talk about with Buddhism, there was really no centralized empire in modern-day India at the time to help this religion spread. So essentially, you have no set financial or authoritative backing for your religion. However, despite this, Buddhism and Hinduism were both able to spread across India because of something called the Sanskrit cosmopolis. This did take place over a very large time frame compared to Islam and Christianity, from about 300 to 1300 CE. But it was a clear attempt by educated priests and intellectuals to spread Indian faith across the area by taking advantage of the fact that despite the fact that they weren't unified, they did have that common culture and Sanskrit language we've mentioned. They were able to establish many schools, universities, and monasteries across the region. For example, Nalanda was established in northeast India, which contained about 10,000 combined scholars and students. This new cultural unity, despite the length of time it took to set up, did also have an estimated control over 1 million square miles, so obviously a pretty huge portion of the world. This also led to a bit of mixing among Hinduism and Buddhism particularly. A lot of beliefs and vocabulary terms became common among both Buddhist and Hindu teachings. Now, especially for the content quiz, for example, one thing I want you to consider a lot with this is it a more effective way of spreading a religion compared to how Christianity was spread throughout the Roman Empire? Is it better to have some sort of empire backing you, or is it better to take a long route and spread it just through cultural assimilation? Keep that in mind as well as we continue. Again, that's all I have for you this week. Just again, make sure you keep up with these due dates and let me know if you have any major questions. Thank you.